witches, and welcome back to A Coven of Two, where we discuss witchcraft and activism. You can call me Isha, my pronouns are she, they, and this is the third installment on problematic sides of witchcraft. And in today's video, we're going to talk about the problematic silence about the Palestinian genocide in Gaza. The video is going to be structured in three main areas. On the first part, we're going to discuss the cornerstone, the fundamentals of the situation in Gaza for those who don't know, because I didn't know, and so possibly gives you a better idea of what is the historical context in which this is happening. The second part is going to be about the live, laugh, love, light part of witchcraft and manifestation that has decided to awarely stay silent on the matter. And the third part is going to be about what can we do? What can we do as activist witches to actually change the situation and make things better for Palestinian people? Which is the reason why for this video you will find in the description some links about how to support Palestinian people in Gaza. Here in Cardiff, we have had direct help and support sent to a journalist in Gaza that goes directly to the families. You'll find all the links for that down in the description below. And also, if you follow me on Instagram, I often share this kind of thing, so you can have your finger more on the pulse of the situation and how to actually help as closely as possible the people that are still in Palestine trying to survive. We are going to start with a bit of an anecdote. Last summer I was at a witchcraft conference, and the main reason I was there was because I wanted to meet Starhawk. Starhawk is the original feminist activist witch. She wrote The Spiral Dance in 1977, then it was published in 79, and she, I think, is one of the first that brought together the idea of witchcraft exists to make the world better, and part of it is furthering the rights of people, and that's why she's a feminist, she is an ecologist. So she started off bringing this idea. She did a workshop and talked at this conference, and during her workshop I was her attendant. I was there to help her. I was part of the organizing team, and I was there for the entire afternoon, and of course she ends her workshops with the spiral dance. And there is something incredibly powerful that even I could feel at the time, without being greatly able to feel energies, in a room full of 20, 30, 40 people, drumming, chanting, going in circle, raising what is called a cone of power, basically. And Starhawk explained that when she participated in Occupy Wall Street, they did a spiral dance there as well. So it's how to use this power for good and for activism, basically. When the workshop finished and she had a moment, I actually dared to go and ask her, I am not great with energy as a witch, but I'm really involved in my community and in activism. How do you suggest I practice and get better with energy sensing? And she told me, of course, to, keep trying, but also made a point of it will always be easier to feel energy when there's a lot of people raising it. So I personally do most of my workings myself or with my wife, so it's just the two of us. And I can tell you, in a room full of people chanting and dancing in the spiral, you could tell that there was something different. All this energy brought together by these people, unified intention, does something. And even I could feel that. Now, Starhawk is of Jewish heritage. Both her parents are immigrants from Russia and Jewish. When she did her talk at the conference, she talked mainly about the intersection of witchcraft and activism. And it was almost a throwaway line, but she mentioned how she has been multiple times in Palestine to help Palestinian people. And I think she made the point of when you need to stand for something, it doesn't have to do with your interest or heritage, you do the right thing. And I think it was really powerful. And I think it's a principal example of, even in the current situation in Gaza, do consider that the actions happening are of the Israeli government, not necessarily of all Jewish people. And there are a lot of Jewish people that have stood up against their own government for the ethnic cleansing that they are doing against Palestinian and Arab people. What was very surprising to me was that after her talk, we were then split in smaller groups during the afternoon, and I was in my own circle with other 10, 15 people. And we were seeing each other every afternoon, talking about what had happened in the conference in the morning, sharing. It was a very supposedly safe place to talk about our experience at the conference, our feelings. In my specific circle, there was a woman who introduced herself the days before as this person from London. I'm going to specify this. I was there to help and being part of the organization because I couldn't have afforded to be there otherwise. Unfortunately, it's another side of witchcraft that is problematic, how intrinsically related at times to capitalism is. And so it's a privilege to afford to go to these kind of places, not only for the ticket price, but also for the fact that if you are somewhere you don't live for a week, 10 days, 2 weeks, all those costs add up. And I am very aware of that because I couldn't afford it. I had to work to be there. This is just to give an idea of, there are different levels of privilege, and being an attendant of this conference was one of them. What surprised me that afternoon was that these circles are supposed to be a safe space for everyone in there. And we used to do a check-in, seeing how everybody was. And I think the second or third person doing a check-in was this woman. And she was livid. She was extremely angry. And you could tell it from her tone of voice. You could tell from all the body language. But something didn't quite click in my head, because the way that she was speaking and the things that she was saying were going in different directions. And so she started to talk about the issues that her and her family had gone through to survive. The fact that her son's school had to hire bodyguards because of the bullying his son was going through. And then it was explained that bullying was actually anti-Semitism. So I realized this person is Jewish. And not for me to Tom polish that, what I'm saying is there was just some dissonance between what she was talking about, being a victim, and the anger that she was projecting out. And it's different from Tom policing because it wasn't just the anger, it was what she asked and demanded was done to Starhawk, who dared being what she described a self-hating Jew for saying that she went to Palestine to help Palestinian people. According to her, she should have been removed from the conference, she should have been sanctioned, she shouldn't have been allowed, and she would have boycotted her with everything she had. At this point, the tones were going so high and loud that, being tired, stressed by working there, and autistic, I was very, very close to have a meltdown. So the higher the tones went, the more I needed space for myself, and so at some point I had to exit the room. The last thing that I heard was being said by this woman was that none of us could understand. Israel is the only place that she will ever feel safe, and anything is wrong in her house in London, Israel is the place that she can take and go to, and she will be safe. And that was the last that I heard of that, because then I had to exit the room. Something that I learned about it afterwards was that the priestess who was the head of this circle tried to diplomatically bring the energy down by explaining to this person that, Starhawk herself is a Jewish person, and it is a matter of bringing together, I guess, different ideas, she tried to explain. And she brought the example of herself, this priestess, being raised in a very progressive, very socialist household, where she had this poster that said, farmers have their house, cows have their stable, Palestinians have nowhere to be. I don't know how this woman took that kind of information, but it was a way to be not quite introduced, because I've been hearing about what happens in the Strip of Gaza since the 90s. But it was the first time that I was physically present during a debate that could have sounded anti-Semitic, but in a larger context explained to me what is Zionism. And what I mean by that is that from this discussion, other than, the high energy levels and my personally being overwhelmed, one thing specifically struck me, and it was the fact that it's true, I have no idea what it was like for this woman to go through anti-Semitic attacks. I am an Arab person, I know about racism, but I don't know specifically about anti-Semitism. But something that struck me was the fact that she said, if something goes ever wrong in my own house, in my own town, in London, I have Israel to go to. And that is the privilege of choice. And that stuck with me. I think the concept of choice stayed with me rightfully because I had to learn from it and I had to start putting things together. And I started doing that after the 7th of October. Cardiff has been very, very proactive. We have been doing protests every Saturday since the 7th of October. And as I mentioned before, I am involved with an organization local here that tries to provide and protect queer people of color. And through it, I had a chance to hear firsthand from friends, people that are refugees here in this country because they are LGBT, whom I didn't know are actually Palestinian. And I didn't know that they are Palestinian because from what I knew, they were coming from actually different countries, from countries bordering Palestine. And through these happenings, I was there to hear them when they needed to vent. And then I started to connect the dots and realize they're not just upset because they're Arab and this is an ethnic cleansing, so it affects everyone of that heritage. No, it's not just that. So something that I understood is that these friends of mine come from the surrounding countries because generations before, their grandparents were actually Palestinians and they have just been dispersed and pushed into the bordering countries by the ethnic cleansing that has been going on since the early 1900s. So they are Palestinian of heritage, but they have no chance. They hear stories from their parents, their grandparents about their forced removal from their country of origin, and they have no chance to go back and see the places that they come from. Not centuries, not heritage, not lost in time in any way, but the house of their grandparents. They can't go back to see it, and it's likely not even there anymore. And now these people are also displaced from their bordering countries because if they are LGBT, it's a danger to their life to be there. Which is also something that, as a queer person, I think I can address. One of the first things that every progressive LGBT person that has stood by Palestine has been shouted at since October was how can you be so privileged to think that you can stand with Palestine and therefore Hamas? The two things are conflated. Being LGBT, because a fundamentalist religious group, terrorist group like Hamas, would not tolerate LGBT people, you would be just killed. How can you stand for that? Israel at least has a pride. And that is something that, in my ignorance, my Palestinian friends explained. They are refugees here because they are LGBT people and in the Arab countries around Palestine, there has been a lot of rising of parties that are actually fundamentally Islamic and religious. It's basically their ultra-conservative Tories, and that's why they bring in Sharia law and are very fundamentally reactionary. They don't want change. What is the problem with change for them? See, the Israel and Palestine situation is not isolated and does not singularly refer to just those two populations, those two countries. The main actors in this situation that shouldn't have been in this situation are Britain and the US. Britain was in charge of the territories of Palestine before World War II. And during World War II, did the very calculated decision of, we're going to promise these territories to different people. Likely they will not survive, all of them, World War II. So whoever survives will get it. And that is why the UK is absolutely not innocent. And in the UK, we do have not only a right, but a duty to protest, because the mess that is happening wouldn't be there if the UK wouldn't have put its nose in it. And then there's the US. The US has a very proven history of going and destabilizing any kind of government in the world that they don't like the tendencies of. The Iranian Revolution in the 60s is one such example. Because of that, and because the US is dying and has been dying to have a proper foothold in the Middle East, and the Iraq world, the war on ISIS, the Al-Qaeda situation have all been excuses all this time for the US to have power over an area that for them is important and rich. It used to be important geographically because it was connected to Russia. So when there was the Cold War, that was the reason. And it's also an area very rich in oil. And oil, unfortunately, is still one of the main drivers of money, therefore capitalism. So when you wonder why during the talks at the United Nations everybody votes for a ceasefire, but the only two vetoes come from Israel and the US, that is kind of the reason why. Also because the US have basically uninterruptedly found a way to go kill, bomb different places in the Middle East for the last 60, 70 years. The far right of these countries have a very easy way demonizing that because, you know, it's the complete idea of the West want to destroy us, which in what America, the US do to them is factually correct. When you start to have that, then everything associated with the West becomes evil by association. So any kind of progressiveness, including LGBT rights, all those things are poisonous because they come from the place that wants to destroy us. And that's why the far right has an easier time. That's why they go fundamentalist, integralist, Sharia law. You cannot be an LGBT person without being persecuted. And I have too many friends that are currently asylum seekers and refugees, not even in this country, in my city. It's people that I see every day that have been displaced from their own home, on top of having generations before being displaced from their own country, because the West has the genuine perception that they can impose and make things better. And you know that kind of sentiment, what is called colonialism. Which brings me to the fundamental reasons of why is this happening. From the media, if you are like me, or even not as involved as me, but just in general from the media what you hear, you might have heard this short version of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's a complicated issue that has been going on for centuries, and we cannot understand, and there are goods and bads on both sides, and then Hamas are the terrorists, so Palestinians bad, and so everything that Israel does to destroy them is acceptable. I don't know if you were half as ignorant as I was, but before the last few months, I genuinely had the impression, for what came to me from the media, that this was indeed a complicated issue because both populations, Israeli and Palestinians, had claims on this piece of land forever. In and out, but forever. And you know, possibly because I come from being educated within an Abrahamic religion, Catholicism, so I've done, Sunday school, Bible studies, and all about that. That comes from the shared Old Testament, so the Jewish history as well, talks about the Kingdom of Israel, which is around, Jerusalem, which is around that piece of land. The fact of the matter is that historically, actually, the Kingdom of Israel as talked about in the Bible is something that was around in 2000 BCE, something like that. And then, unfortunately, part of the history of the Israeli is how they were continually displaced. And then you have the history of Egypt, and then you have the Exodus, and then you have all these things, and the 12 tribes of Israel go everywhere. The idea of the Israelis' homeland is that area around Jerusalem that used to be the Kingdom of Israel. So, given the rise in anti-Semitism, that's where a nation, a country of Israel should rise. It's just as old as 1897, and it rose in the first Zionist Congress of Basel. The idea that it's always been the Jewish people land, but not the Arabs, not everyone else that is there, is conflated with biblical history, but then the issue of heritage comes in. And basically, for some reason, which I think it's biblical, but correct me if you think that is something different, the claim of heritage of the Israeli people is considered more valid and is considered a year zero, so to speak, compared to anyone else that has ever lived in that country. And based on that idea, then, from 1897, they were just moving back home. The main crux of the issue, though, as I mentioned before, is that actually this kind of mentality is colonial. So at this point, Jewish people have lived for almost 4,000 years since the Kingdom of Israel of 2000 BCE, outside of the lands that we want to describe today as Israel. Which makes you wonder, when do you establish year zero? These are the oldest people that can claim this land, and so whoever has come after doesn't have as much of a right. That brings in the issue of heritage. Now, by all means, heritage is defined by a common culture and a common solidarity and a common homeland, whether it's inhabited, that homeland, or not, but there's these common roots. But then the issue becomes, why does Israel say that there is no such thing as Palestinian people? Why their heritage, their Arab heritage, matters less? Technically, there are Mizrahi Jews within Palestinian people, because the Mizrahi ethnicity of Jewish people are all those Jewish people within Arab culture and territories. And considering that Judaism is an ethno-religion, so it brings together both an ethnicity and a religious credo, technically Christianity and Islam, as other two of the Abrahamic religions, are offshoots of that. So isn't that all the same heritage? Why Israel decided as first? And I do get that at the end of the 19th century, anti-Semitism was very much rising in Europe, and then we saw how it ended up with World War II. But to me, the peculiar thing remains, especially because as people, you have this generational trauma of having gone through an ethnic cleansing. I guess it always comes down to there are two kinds of people at the bottom of a situation. There's the kind of person that has gone through something, knows it's unacceptable and will fight tooth and nail for that to never happen again to anyone. Or there's the person that has gone through hell and has hardened through it enough to think, if I have survived that, so need others, because that way you will divide the wheat from the chaff, without realizing that the survivors are those that manage to survive the horrible things. Yes, give me a second, because this is heavy. This is just to set the stage to explain why whenever we hear it's a complicated situation and both parties have as much of a right, it's not historically accurate, because biblical history and modern history are two very different things. And again, at which point do you establish this is the oldest that we're going to look at? To this effect, let me bring the example of something that I know up close, which is Italy. And its example, much as it's very simplified, and I am not conflating it with anti-Semitism, knows of a lot of internal racism. And here's the reason why. The southern of Italy has been, throughout history, very heavily influenced by North Africa, to the point that genetically, a lot of people from the south not only have traits, but if tested, would reveal certain amounts of North Africa genetic code. Now, where do we establish the concept of ethnicity, state, nation, blood, belonging, when something like this happens? When mingling happens, when mixed race happens? The Italian people from Sicily are Italian just as much as someone from Milan or from the very north of the east, the ones that are actually speaking German or French. But one of the main socio-political issues that Italy has had since forever, really, since the fall of the Roman Empire, is the north-south divide. People from the north consider themselves properly white and look down upon the people of the south, amongst many other reasons, for the fact that they are impure. They are conflated with all those characteristics that are considered bad/black, and so they are lazy, they are naturally inclined to mislead you, and they're naturally inclined to be criminals and dishonest. All of that because technically the original Italian tribes, Etruscans, even before Romans, were technically from Tuscany, were that part of white. Is that why they are more Italian and therefore a claim on not only the Italian nation but the Italian identity than people from the south? Is that a valid reason for the racism and hatred? And these bring us to what I mentioned at the beginning about this is not a heritage or right of occupation of homeland issue. This is a colonial issue. There's a beautiful book by Rashid Khalidi that is called The 100 Years' War on Palestine. Nothing that I can put in this video will explain as succinctly and clearly where the origin of the conflict comes from. And again, it doesn't come from biblical time, it comes from 1897. Rashid is actually the great-great-grandson of the mayor of Jerusalem in the late 1800s. He had access to letters, documents. The Khalidi family had established one of the biggest private but accessible to the public libraries that there were in Jerusalem. There are incredibly old documents there. and he had access to all of this. And the point where this book starts is in exchange of letter between his great-grandfather, Yusuf Dia, and Theodor Herzl, which is the father of modern Zionism, and the person who established the idea of anti-Semitism is rising here. We need a safe place for Jewish people. We should go back to the Kingdom of Israel. The most interesting point, coming directly from the notes of Herzl, was about the plan for this to happen. His idea was that the territory of Palestine, which were known as Palestine back then, were really just full of nomadic people. And what Israeli could have done was starting to move there and start to create job opportunities for the people currently settling there in the neighboring countries, so that they would naturally move towards those leaving the land of Israel to Israeli people. When Yusuf Dia knows and learns about the ideas of Herzl, writes to him a beautifully sympathetic letter, having extreme sympathy and understanding for the need of Israeli people to have their own land. And with all the trouble that is bubbling up in Europe, who could question that? And usually that bit of the letter actually is misquoted as an admission of even Arab people that the land of Palestine actually belongs to Israel. However, because the fundamental ideas and ways of implementing them of Herzl were documented, Yusuf Dia made a point of there are Palestinians here. There's the people that have been living here for centuries. You cannot come here and just push them away. I beseech you to relent on this idea, because you cannot displace an entire country for you to build the ideal of Israel as it was in biblical times. And the reply of Herzl is very peculiar. He ignores completely the fact that people are living there and presents the same idea that colonial powers present when they start to set their eye on a foreign country. And he says, oh, but we will improve things. We will move there and we will bring our wealth with us, and we will improve the economy, we will improve the infrastructure. We are only going to be better and bring better things to the land that will be Israel. And that is what colonial powers do. This idea that the magnanimous civilization is gonna come and set things right and straight for the savages that accidentally occupy those places. And this is just the beginning of the dusting. I genuinely encourage you to take a hold of this book. It's incredibly simple and incredibly accessible, and explains to you the last 120 years of what's been actually going on for the territories of Palestine and the colonial reasons behind them. So if you have heard talking about colonialism on the Palestine-Israel situation, that explains to you why. And along with the fact that you get to understand, oh, this is not something that has been going on since biblical time, but since 1897, that starts to put things into perspective on who's the colonizer and who are the people that have ever only known their home to be Palestine. As a final note on this socio-ethnographic premise, it is the West's fault, specifically Britain's fault, because not only, as I mentioned, like the US at this point has an interest having a foothold in the Middle East, but all the anti-Semitism that was rising in the Victorian era and up until World War II was condoned by countries like Britain. The issue of anti-Semitism in Europe was rising because there were systemic issues, and there was indeed anti-Semitism around. So Britain went, let's make this the Middle East problem. They want to establish Israel in a land far, far away from us, where they won't bother us. Let them go there. And that's the reason why after World War II, the promise of this land was upheld. And that's the reason why Britain and all our MPs to this day will not vote for a ceasefire. And America, same story, because the existence of Israel upheld their own anti-Semitism in getifying Jewish people in a place far, far away from them so that it wasn't their problem. Now that we've done this huge historical and cultural premise, how does this impact the witchcraft community? I am relatively lucky even within my witchcraft circle because, as I mentioned before, I naturally gravitate towards people that also are progressive, queer, activist, both in my 3D real life and therefore in the people that I follow online. Until I noticed Kim Saira, who is a sound healer and somatic healer. And they started to bring up the issue in Palestine and the genocide happening, and I was so glad. And by all means, along with her, there are people like Kellyanne Maddox, Juliet Diaz. Again, I am very, very glad that my feed, my served information through Instagram was very well catered to the person that I am. Like, I didn't necessarily have a lot of the perception that people were being silent. Until Kim Saira specifically started to bring up, why is the live, laugh, love, light community being so silent about the genocide of Palestine? And the moment that they mentioned it, I started to look into it. And then I started to realize that a couple, not many, but a couple of the accounts that I were following were at best being silent, at worst explaining that they were silent because I don't have the spoons, I don't have the energy, or worse, I don't want to go along with it because hermetic axiom, as above so below, as within so without. Otherwise said, likes attract likes. So if I talk or get myself involved with something with such bad energy as a war, I will bring that energy to my life and I cannot deal. A, how much fucking privilege do you need to have to be able to make that choice awarely? And B, this is a fundamental misunderstanding of how the entire concept of like, attract lights and energy works. Because whether you accept it, acknowledge it or not, this is what's going on in the world. This is the energy that is going on. And believe you me, a conflict like that creates an amount of energy that you do not counteract by ignoring it in your own gilded townhouse or villa or cottage or anywhere that you are safe enough to be able to ignore this. It reminded me the beginning, the premise of Existential Kink by Caroline Elliott, PhD. And it's basically the quintessential modern book about shadow work. And it begins with a beautiful quote that basically explains the issue that the light manifestation community has with toxic positivity, basically. What I had learned and what Existential Kink teaches is that the key to a magical life rests in delving into the other end of the spectrum, finding the power of the darkness. One of my course participants described it in this perfect analogy. I realized that when you only focus on the light and positive thinking, then it's like you're staring up at the sun without looking down to notice that you were standing in a pile of feces. Something smells bad, but as long as you stare at the light, then all the bad will go away. And instead of cleaning up the poo, you spray perfume, affirmations, all over it. Meanwhile, shadow work is looking down at the shit so you can clean it up or even compost it into a lush garden. By all means, as I said, here in Cardiff, we have had, at the very least, a protest a week since October. Sometimes more than that. Sometimes, middle of the week, there were protests to go in front of the offices of our MPs, which wouldn't call for a ceasefire, and blatantly the majority of people wanted that. Some friends of mine have been there every single week, every single protest, to the point that some of them are asylum seekers or refugees, so protesting, it's something relatively dangerous for their political and legal status in this country. They have to be careful about that. And I do appreciate that there can be such a thing as spiritual burnout that becomes psychic numbness, and you don't know how to find the energy to do things anymore, and everything just becomes static and aligned, and that's where endurance come in play. And I think that something incredibly valuable is realizing that you are not alone in this. When I don't have the physical energy to go to the protest, I am still sharing them. I am still sharing all the activities that are being organized. I am still part of all those communities that are trying to gather support and send funds over to Gaza directly. I am currently part of organizing an event of LGBT people in support of Gaza. You can do so many things, and the most important thing is that when you realize that you are not alone, there naturally is an exchange of energy there. Hala Alyan has a beautiful post, which I'll link down in the description below, about being steadfast in the time of psychic numbing. And I think that realistically, the fulcrum of the discussion there is community. Which actually circles back and brings me back to what I talked about at the beginning with Starhawk being the original activist witch. When I asked her about what can I do to feel more energy, she brought up the fact that when things are going on in a group with a lot of people, energy rises. So somebody recently asked me, well, as activist witches, what can we do? What spells can we do? What work can we do to bring a ceasefire and peace to Gaza? And it might not be as easy as just lighting a candle, but I genuinely believe that going to protests with intention is what makes a difference. You have hundreds of people marching, raising energy, chanting with the same intention. As witches, we have the ability to direct intention into manifestation. Being part of those events with all those people in the same place at the same time with the same intention is what changes things. Here in Cardiff, we have done occupations of Starbucks, of Zara. If you direct and channel that energy, it happens. It's in small increments, and sometimes it's frustrating at the idea of, I am just one. Will it make a difference if I am there? And that happens to a lot of people. And if we all go along with that, it's the kind of complacency that basically allows us to use and lose democracy, actually. So yeah, when you have the physical energy, you are there, you gather energy, and for what you know of witchcraft, you try your best to direct that energy into making the situation better. The last protest that I was at, I literally started to envision this cone of energy coming up from the people and shooting up in the sky, and then visualizing the globe and going down where, in my head, Palestine is. And it might sound very silly, and if that doesn't do anything, my presence there at least did something. So you can go there and use visualization. If your visualization doesn't work, at least you're there, and being there is better than doing nothing. If you can be there, share about the events is better than doing nothing. Anything is better than doing nothing and sitting by while an entire race is being erased. That also becomes a well of energy where all the people that feel disheartened with the idea of, I'm just one, what difference does it make? All those people raising that energy together makes you feel and understand, I can be part of that. And that is a well of shared energy that everybody can partake in, and then redirect it to make things better and finally bring a definitive, ultimate ceasefire to save what is left of Palestine. They have already lost generations to come, and Governments have had a very easy time thinking that 10, 20, 30 years in the future, apologizing is gonna cleanse their souls of the decisions that they have done. Here in the UK, we know it very well. The Tories at some point apologized for Section 28, which was against LGBT people. That didn't change the decades that people had to go through oppressed. They apologized for their colonial situation in Ireland with Bloody Sunday, but that doesn't bring things back. The craziest thing to me at the moment is that it is very obvious how history books will report this, and all that the US and Britain have to do in 20 years' time is just say sorry. I don't think so, and they should be reminded that that is not enough. I think witchcraft at its core is indeed about creating change and making things better for yourself, but also for the world, because again, it makes no use to make things better for yourself and do your own spell while the rest of the world is crumbling around you, because if that is the energy of the world, believe you me, there's not enough affirmations and manifestations that you can do to detach yourself from that energy. The only work you can do is to actually try and improve the energy of the world so that your own life will reflect that. So do not think that you can isolate yourself from the horrible things of the world, because if they are happening in the world, they are happening to you to a certain level. So if nothing else, be selfish. Make the world better because you are in it. I hope this video was useful. You find the entire bibliography to find sources about the things that I talked about down in the description below. If you have any questions, I very well encourage to leave me a comment so that I can get back to you. Most importantly, I will link all the events and fundraisers that I know here locally that are directly sending funds to Gaza, because it was something extremely consoling. Like, there are a lot of organizations that are raising funds and then they are sending them and all of that. But in our case, there were people so incredibly proactive that they got in touch with journalists that are directly on the territory in Gaza, made sure of their identity, got in touch and sent them funds directly. And we got to see what those funds were doing directly for those 20, 30 families that could take advantage of it in Gaza. And that is as much as from thousands of miles away we can do. I wholeheartedly encourage you to check out those resources, and if you want to help, that is a very direct way that you can do that. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope that until the next video we can hex the patriarchy together. Because fuck me if there's need for it.